Our reading is from the book of Esther, chapters 4 and 7. Mordecai mourned when he found out what had happened. He ripped his clothes, put on sackcloth, and wiped ash onto his body. Then he went through the city, weeping loudly in anguish. When he came to the king's gate, not far from the palace, he stopped, since those wearing sackcloth were not allowed to enter it and disrupt the mood of the court. In the meantime, as the word of the king's decree began to spread throughout all of the provinces, terrible distress grew among the Jews. They fasted, wept, and screamed out in misery. Like Mordecai, many put on sackcloth and ashes. Back in Susa, Esther's maids and eunuchs witnessed Mordecai mourning outside of the king's gate. They went and reported to the queen all that they saw. "What is wrong?" Esther asked. "Why is he doing this? It breaks my heart to think of him like this. Take these clothes to Mordecai so he can put them on instead of wearing sackcloth." But when the servants arrived, Mordecai refused to wear the clothes Queen Esther had sent. So Esther sent for Hathach, who was one of the king's eunuchs assigned to serve her. "Hathach, go to Mordecai at once," Esther said. "Find out why he is mourning and report back to me all that he says." Hathach went to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told the king's servant everything that had happened and how much money Haman had pledged to place into the royal treasury in exchange for the destruction of the Jews. Then he gave Hathach a copy of the order for mass murder of the Jews, the same order issued in the city of Susa. "Show it to Esther," Mordecai said. "Tell her everything I have told you. Convince her to go before her king and plead for his favor, not only for her life, but also for the lives of her people." Hathach returned to Esther and told her everything Mordecai had said. Esther ordered Hathach to return to the city gate and reply to Mordecai. "How am I supposed to see the king?" Esther asked. "It is known throughout the land, from the greatest of the king's officials to the common folk who live in the provinces, that any person who approaches the king in the inner chamber without being invited is sentenced to death. That's the law. There's only one exception, and that's if the king were to hold out the gold scepter to that person and spare his or her life. It's been 30 days since the king last summoned me." Hathach and the other servants took Esther's response to Mordecai. Mordecai said this: "Tell Esther, don't be fooled. Just because you are living inside the king's palace doesn't mean that you, out of all the Jews, will escape the carnage. You must go before your king. If you stay silent during this time, deliverance for the Jews will come from somewhere. But you, my child, and all of your father's family will die. And who knows, perhaps you have been made queen for such a time as this." Once again, Hathach returned to Queen Esther with Mordecai's message. In turn, she sent a reply to Mordecai. Esther told Mordecai, "In preparation for my audience with the king, do this: gather together all the Jews in Susa and fast and pray for me. Intercede for me. For 3 days and nights, abstain from all food and drink. My maids and I will join you in this time. And after the 3 days, I will go to the king and plead my people's case, even though it means breaking the law. And if I die, then I die." King Ahasuerus and Haman came to dine with Queen Esther. And while they were drinking wine, the king posed his question once again. "What is your request, Queen Esther?" asked the king. "I'm willing to give you anything you want. Just make your request. Even if it's half the kingdom you desire, I will make it happen." Queen Esther said, "If you favor me, my king, and if it pleases you, spare my life. That's all I'm asking, that my people and I be spared. That is my wish. There are some, my king, who wish to rid your kingdom of us. For my people and I have been sold, marked for destruction and massacre. Now, if the plan were simply to sell our men and women into slavery, I would have kept my mouth closed, because that would not have been important enough to disturb you, my king." King Ahasuerus asked, "Who has targeted your people? Where is this man who dares to do this?" Queen Esther said, pointing to Haman, "The man responsible for these actions is wicked Haman. He is vile and an enemy to my people."
Esther is a fairly well-known story to many of us, but it is a long story. And because of that, it's difficult to preach on in one sermon. If you're one of those preachers that needs to give the full picture, sorry, I am one of those. But don't worry, I've condensed this as much as I can. But it's really an engaging and intriguing story. And so our scripture today, it takes place in Persia. And so to give you an idea of the timeline, it's after the exile of the Israelites. And actually, some Jews have returned to Israel by this time, but they are struggling there to rebuild their community and find stability. And many Jews decide to stay in Persia, where they can be better off. But these Jews are still foreigners living in Persia. They carry with them that very recent history of being exiled from their homeland. They stand out and are different from Persians and surely had incidents of being othered and persecuted. But from what we understand, Persia was a pretty diverse place. And so our main character, Esther, she becomes queen after a series of events. And so the king asks his former wife, Queen Vashti, to come to a party so he can show off her beauty. And in a comic twist, she says no. And so the king deposes her. And what I love is he sends out a letter to the whole kingdom about how husbands are heads of the household. So just a reminder, y'all, don't say no to your man. And of course, he wants to find a new wife. So all of these virgins are brought in and go through this process of like beauty treatments, and they spend nights with the king, and the king falls for Esther. And she becomes queen, and she hides her Jewishness as ordered by her cousin, Mordecai. And Mordecai is also a bit of an adopted dad figure for her, as her parents had died and he raised her as his daughter. And Mordecai ends up making an important official named Haman very angry by repeatedly not bowing to him. And Haman decides that instead of letting this go, he is going to retaliate by ordering a genocide of the Jewish people. Perhaps Haman harbored or proudly displayed anti-Semitism. Maybe he was just looking for an opportunity to punish them, get rid of them, spill his hatred upon them. But Haman is very sneaky with the king when he goes about this. He does not specify what group of people needs to be destroyed. He just calls them an insignificant group of foreigners, people who haven't adopted our customs. Their laws different from all other peoples. They do not keep your laws, O king, he says. Therefore, it's not a good idea for you to tolerate them or their actions any longer. And Haman offers to sponsor the costs of the genocide. And our text says, not knowing the group of people targeted, the king signs this edict. And Mordecai learns of this, as do the community of Jews, and the city of Susa is thrown into chaos. And the Jews, rightly so, begin to be severely distressed and panic. A commentator that I read said that Persia and Susa was a very diverse land, and there was a fair amount of acceptance of difference, and this order is just really confusing for everyone. Why the Jews? They've been living peacefully here for a few generations now, and the Jews are terrified. And once again, in their history, they are a people targeted out of hatred and oppression. This is a death sentence for women, men, and children. This has been ordered, and they have no power whatsoever to change it. And so Mordecai turns to the one who does have some power, Queen Esther. And he convinces her to risk her life, to plead her people's case before the king. And she decides to reveal her Jewish ethnicity, knowing that the king has put out an edict ordering a genocide of all Jews, and decides to come to the king without being summoned, which is punishable by death. And she very easily could have decided to not say anything, to remain in the palace isolated from the anguish of her people. Say, Mordecai, I'm sorry, but I cannot do what you're asking me to do. But Esther goes to the king, and she uses her knowledge and a bit of manipulation here. For example, she knows the king loves to drink. I feel like he's drunk for half of this story, no lie. And she knows he loves her. And so she decides to throw the king and Haman a banquet. And at this banquet, she pleads the king to save her people. She reveals her Jewish identity and asks the king to spare her life and the life of her people. And the king is filled with wrath that someone would do this to his queen, and says, who is doing this to your people? Like, don't you remember you signed something a little bit ago? And Haman's orders are revealed. And so beyond our chosen scripture for today, we learn Haman is executed. And the king, he gives Esther the household of Haman, and she puts Mordecai in charge of the household, giving him a great deal of power, which is a victorious moment for the Jews. One of their own has another powerful place in government. And this book, it's often preached as a hero story. It's the story behind a very joyous holiday for the Jewish people known as Purim. And if the story ended there, I would see it as a story of great triumph and victory for the Jewish people, but it's a little more complicated than that. You see, unfortunately, once an edict by a king has been sent out in Persia, it cannot be undone. So once Haman is killed, Esther still has the job of figuring out how to save her people. The king tells her that he's done all he can do, and it's Esther's responsibility, which to me is a cop-out. You're the king, change the policy. But anyway, there is a date on everyone's calendar still that marks the day of killing the Jews in Susa and all the surrounding provinces. So Esther and now Mordecai, with their power, they write a different edict. And in chapter 8, it tells us that Mordecai wrote letters in the name of the king, sealed them with the king's ring, and sent them by mounted couriers riding on fast steeds bred from the royal herd. And by these letters, the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to assemble and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, their children and their women, and to plunder their goods on a single day throughout all the provinces of the king on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And so this was like a defense measure against an edict that cannot be reversed, allowing a people to kill those who are trying to kill them with the government's stamp of approval. And chapter 9 tells us later that 75,000 Persians total were killed by Jews in the 127 provinces of Persia. And there's great rejoicing in the reversal of the Jewish people's fate. So I've been on a journey with this text this week. And perhaps I'm in a more tender place because Gaza and Ukraine and Sudan are on my mind. You know, am I naive for thinking that the world is not made well here? For finishing reading the book of Esther and not feeling the joy and the victory, to read it and not be able to rejoice in the killing of that many people? Should I be confused for wondering why a mark of the Purim holiday is overwhelming joy and elation, and it's celebrated today with costumes and little pastries that are called Haman's ears? Is this a story where we just have to accept that if it wasn't 75,000 Persians, it would be 75,000 Jews? Do I or we just need to accept the violence, especially when it's couched within a legal system that doesn't allow any other solution? And we all may have different opinions on this. People who have been really hurt and abused by a group of people may see this as a victory story, because what else were the Jews supposed to do? You know, they understand what it feels like to be oppressed, what it feels like to fight for your right to live, and the anger you feel against your oppressor. And there are many, many times that the Bible breaks my heart. Times when I have learned and relearned how complicated some of these stories are, that they aren't as simple as I was taught when I was a child. Curse you, VeggieTales. I remember the first time I learned about the details of the God-ordained genocide in the book of Joshua, where one of my formerly favorite verses comes from. Be strong and courageous, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. And rereading Esther this week was another one of those times. This week, my heart broke more for the characters and people like Haman, people with immense power who, in a moment of hatred and retribution, make choices with irreparable and devastating consequences. My heart broke for Esther and Mordecai, who probably felt like they did not have a choice here and were fighting against time. And I think near the end, perhaps let the power go to their head a little bit too much, since Esther asked the king for one more day to exact justice on the Jews' enemies. And my heart broke for the king in power, who had the ability to change things much more than he did. The king who signed an edict ordering the destruction of an entire people, and he didn't even know what group he was approving the murder of. It's within this story that we learn that making the world well can be really, really complicated. The Jews' world was not well, and so in order to make it well, they defended themselves, especially with an edict that couldn't be reversed, and killed a whole mass of people. Many times, someone has tried to make their world well, and as a result, it made someone else's world very unwell. Their own world was ripped apart or threatened, and so they took action to bring justice, which ripped apart someone else's world. And then that person or family goes on to carry that hurt and hurt someone else. And on a large scale, a large long-term scale, this is one of the heartbreaks of war. And the effects of war and violence and displacement are well documented and studied, and how they affect individuals and societies for years. I think it's important to distinguish what making the world well means, not just our world, but the world. And I want to acknowledge that speaking about this objectively is easy compared to living this out, which is even harder, especially if we have been harmed. Making the world well does not mean that we satisfy our own personal agendas, that we satisfy our anger in the way that we want, as nice as that can feel. It doesn't mean that we settle the score on a long-time grudge or battle. And I just cannot believe that making the world well means revenge or an eye for an eye mentality. Killing 75,000 people isn't a world made well, and surely we can see it as the impossible situation that it was, and grieve that it couldn't be resolved without bloodshed. So dream with me for a moment. Perhaps making the world well means working to create systems that allow for wholeness and forgiveness, accountability and dignity. In our Esther story, Haman is certainly the villain, but another villain is that stupid bureaucratic system that doesn't allow reversal of edicts. How many times have you and I heard that, yeah, that sucks, but that's the system? Often in reference to someone who can't get what they need, or the reason someone who desperately needs healing gets way too much power and misuses a powerful system. Making the world well means that we strive for the healing of all, and that begins with our own healing. When we work on that journey of healing our own wounds, and for many of us, it's a lifelong journey, and it's a frustrating journey, because healing is not linear. It's so frustrating to me that I can heal in one area and then kind of have some sort of problem or incident come up, and I'm reminded that, I need to heal a little bit more. It's not a simple A to B process. But when we can be on that journey and stay on that journey, we can center ourselves and remember our values and act from those instead of external events that incite our emotions. When we heal our wounds, we act more from a place of wholeness and less from a place of enacting justice on our terms, which continues the harm cycle and does not really work for either party. And it's not from a place of being a doormat who allows ourselves to be harmed, but knowing that there is a better way than retribution or redemptive violence. I remember in seminary, in a theology of exile and suffering class, my friend, now my husband, said, redemptive violence is still violence. And I still think about that every time I see a movie that glorifies a character that uses redemptive violence. I love Richard Rohr's reflection, titled Transforming Pain. And I've read it over and over and over again over several years, and it's a very meaningful crossover between my therapy journey and my faith, which describes Richard Rohr's writing very well. And as I read this quote, I invite you to close your eyes to soak it in. He writes, "If we cannot find a way to make our wounds into sacred wounds, we invariably become cynical, negative, or bitter. This is the storyline of many of the greatest novels, myths, and stories of every culture. If we do not transform our pain, we will most assuredly transmit it, usually to those closest to us, our family, our neighbors, our coworkers, and invariably the most vulnerable, our children. Scapegoating, exporting our unresolved hurt, is the most common storyline of human history. The Jesus story is about radically transforming history and individuals so that we don't just keep handing on the pain to the next generation. We shouldn't try to get rid of our own pain until we've learned what it has to teach. When we can hold our pain consciously and trustfully and not project it elsewhere, we find ourselves in a very special liminal space. Here we are, open to learning and breaking through to a much deeper level of faith and consciousness. Please trust me on this, Richard writes. We must all carry the cross of our own reality until God transforms us through it. These are the wounded healers of the world, and healers who have fully faced their wounds are the only ones who heal anyone else. When we can hold our pain consciously and trustfully and not project it elsewhere, we find ourselves in a very special liminal space. How much evil and harm in the world would be prevented if we could see what our pain could teach us, to not pass it on to someone else, to turn our wounds into sacred wounds. And sometimes I wonder with those people who have done some of the worst crimes to humanity. Sometimes I wonder if they didn't receive someone else's pain, if they didn't receive that harm and absorb it and want to harm others, I wonder what they would be like. I wonder what the world would be like. I wonder if Haman received any harm in his younger life, and if that would have changed his choices that led to the killing of thousands of people. We are in Eastertide, and we are remembering the resurrection of Jesus. Thanks be to God for that, for the life of Jesus and his resurrection. A story that shows us how God transformed a horrible act by an empire. An act that very easily could have spurred a lot of retributive justice-seeking violence and harm. And God did not take God's own pain and project it onto the rest of the world. Jesus took the scars on his hands and his feet and his side and showed us that harm and pain do not have to define us, that it can be transformed into something sacred. Friends, the healing journey of turning our wounds into sacred wounds and sacred scars is really, really, really hard work to do. It's so much easier to pass on our pain, to hurt other people. But that is not what we are called to do as followers of Jesus, followers of the risen Christ. We are called to make the world well, bit by bit, in tiny and large ways. And it starts with ourselves. Amen.